I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air, but in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard.
Suppose for a second that you are a white woman and you marry a black slave, and then the town around you had no problem with enslaving your children. If you had magical powers, what would you do to that town? Would you hold a grudge? Would you ever let it go? When we think about the transatlantic slave trade in the United States, many people will often claim that the northern part of the US never had slaves and that much of slavery was relegated to the South. And nothing could be further from the truth. And now in this series, I would usually discuss sundown towns, but we have a whole state of Rhode Island that was essentially a sundown town. And not only was Rhode Island prolific with slave ownership, but the colony of Rhode Island at one point had the highest percentage of slaves in New England and was pivotal to the transatlantic slave trade. What drove a lot of this slave trade was the sale of rum and other goods. And you see, the rum was being produced in the Caribbean by Caribbean slaves. And then the money that was gained from selling the rum was then used to buy more slaves. And then those slaves were brought in through Rhode Island or the port of Charleston in South Carolina, where 40% of the slaves came through. The enslavement of black people began roughly in 1638, but most likely began much earlier. My proof of this is not just a bunch of empty claims, but what you see on the screen before you is my actual family lineage from ancestry.com. And if you go up the tree here, you'll find the reasons why I made this video in the first place. My name's Dion, my mother's name is Jacinto, and she was named after her father, Jacinto Rhines Jr., and then his father, Jacinto Sr., and his mother, Julia Marie Watson, and then her parents is Charles Watson and Pauline Gears, and Pauline Gears' parents is Thomas C. Gears and Mary J.P. Turner. The parents of Thomas Gears are Joseph Gears and Susan B. Sands, and the Sands name is very important, so pay attention. We don't know the father of Susan Sands, but we do know her mother, who is Emily Port Sands, and the mother and father of Emily Port Sands is Thomas Port and Mary Bagley Port. And then you have Benjamin Sands and Mary Port, and that goes up to Newport Sands and Catherine. Now you may be wondering, who are these people? Well, in order for me to explain who these two people are, you gotta understand three things. One, you have a slave, and then you have a 17th century white witch from Germany and a ghost ship. Now I know that all sounds ridiculous, but trust me, you'll get how all of those things are somehow related.
From this time, it is said, the Palatine Light appeared, and there are many who firmly believe it to be a ship of fire, to which their fantastic and distempered imaginations figure masts, ropes, and flowing sails. Dr. Aaron C. Wiley wrote to a fellow physician, 1811.
In order to tell this story, we have to go back in time, all the way back to the 1600s in Germany. There was an area in Germany along the Rhine River Valley known as the Palatinate, but many people refer to it as Palatine in honor of the Holy Roman Empire and the ruling family in that area. That area was known to be very superstitious, and I want you to keep that in mind for later, because whether you know it or not, that's gonna come into play, specifically with my lineage. In 1618, there was a bloody conflict known as the 30 Years' War, and you're talking about 96 years of continuous fighting that led to one of the worst refugee crises of the 1600s in Europe. And this fighting was so intense that thousands of Germans, particularly the people located in the Palatine area, all left Germany. And they left Germany versus fighting for their homeland, because you see, it seems to be much easier to go over to another land where you have black slaves who are building up a homeland for them to escape to. And many white Americans may not realize it, but if they have German ancestry, there is a chance that they came from people who were refugees and not these big brain intellects that many of them try to portray their ancestors as. And the Palatine area in particular was known to be hammered by different forces. Like for example, in 1623, as much as 50% of the Palatine area was eradicated by the Spanish and Bavarians. Then in 1688, you had the War of Grand Alliance where the French actually invaded the Palatine area. And then you had 1701 where the French came back and smashed that area yet again. And so it comes at no surprise that many Germans in that area just left that area and said, screw this. We would rather go over to the area where you have black slaves building up all this wealth in a free homeland for us to run to. Now we come to the year 1738, and I had to go through the 1600s to set the stage for what you're about to hear. This book was written by a woman named Jill Farinelli, and it's about the 1738 voyage of a ship that was known as the Princess Augusta. And if you want to know where the Princess Augusta got its name from, well, that's a very interesting story in of itself. You see, Augusta was the name of a British princess who lived in the 17th century into the early 18th century, and you see, she was inbred. Yes, the ship that my 8th great-grandmother sailed into America on was named after an inbred princess. And so when I hear members of the dominant white society criticize my ancestors, but my 8th great-grandmother had to sail on a ship that was named after an inbred princess, well, no offense to anybody in the dominant white society, but I would really reconsider criticizing anyone's ancestors. But that's not the main point. Let's go back to the ship itself. That ship sailed from Rotterdam in June of 1738. There were 340 passengers on board. It is unclear as to what happened aboard the ship, but one thing that was certain is that the ship crashed for whatever reason. Some historians claim that it came down to ill preparation because you had a lot of people who were on board, which means that the ship probably ran out of rations. There could have been sick people on board. Then you have the elements such as storms that might be to blame for the Princess Augusta crashing. But there are other stories, like for example, some people claim that the ship's crew was robbing the passengers, but that has not been confirmed. What has been confirmed is that the ship was set on fire, because in the modern day, people claim that even now they can see a flaming ship that appears near Block Island where it crashed. We're getting into the supernatural, so strap in, folks. One of the other reasons why that ship is said to still appear is because of 2 passengers who were on board who were said to be witches. And if you don't believe that, well, if you actually read Jill Farinelli's book and you check out part 4, which is titled The Legend, and you check out chapter 11, the title of that chapter is actually referencing my 8th great-grandfather and my 8th great-grandmother. And that's why the title of chapter 11 is The Witch and the Slave. Who do you think the witch and the slave were? It says here 2 young women made the extraordinary decision to stay behind on Block Island in Rhode Island, while the other survivors resumed their journey to Philadelphia. They are known to us only as Short Kate and Long Kate, nicknames given by the islanders to distinguish between the 2, who were presumably both named Katerina or some variant. We don't know their ages, whether they are related, or with whom they had traveled. All we know of the women derives from Block Island tradition and from stories handed down through descendants of Lone Kate. And now you might be asking yourself, well, you said that she was a witch. What proof do you have of this? If you read from the official history of Block Island, you will see the mention of Catherine, who was known to be a witch. And here's a direct quote. One of these passengers, a woman, married a black slave belonging to Mr. Littlefield, and that's referring to Nathaniel Littlefield, who was affiliated with the Sands family. Her name was Kate and was commonly called Catherine. And it mentions specifically that Catherine was a witch. And it is actually written in the official history of Block Island that this woman was supposedly a fortune teller who said to have been able to astrally project herself to go visit her family members over in Holland. And so she's actually from Holland and not Germany, but she spent so much time in Germany that she became a German citizen. Everyone on Block Island was apparently afraid of her, and once you are labeled a witch in the 1700s, well, your dating options and marriage options are very much limited, which probably explains why it's also listed here that she married a black slave. And you might be asking, why in the world would Catherine curse Block Island like this? And why would she terrorize the citizens? I mean, they did take her in, but that wasn't the problem here. The reason why she was so angry with the residents of Block Island is because they were okay with slavery. And I want to remind you that Catherine married a black slave who was my 8th great-grandfather. And here is a screenshot from my Ancestry.com page that shows my 7th great-grandfather, who is the son of Newport Sands and Catherine. And his name is Benjamin Sands, but he was also known as Benaja. And so let me ask you a question. What would you do to a town if they enslaved your babies? How long would you hold that grudge? And so I want to discuss the slave lineage that I come from. This is the historical sketch of Block Island, published by William P. Sheffield, 1876. I want to discuss the head of the Sands family. And the head of the Sands family is a guy named James Sands. He formerly resided in Portsmouth, but he had to leave. And he left because the Native Americans that he was fighting against in the French Indian War, they chased him out, and they chased him to Block Island. And so I want to show you his wife. And the reason why I want to show you his wife is because his wife, Sarah Sands, became one of the first slave abolitionists in American history. And I want to read out this one passage here. It says, James Sands, he passed away at Block Island on March 13th, 1695. Sarah Sands, widow of James, made her will March 9th, 1699, which was proof July 6, 1702, in which she said, quote, in obedience to a promise I have made that no child under my protection and care should be made a slave of, and in ratification and confirmation of this, end quote. She then goes on to say that she would free them, bringing up all the black children that were slaves. These were child slaves, my family members. Like the passage here says, she is in fact one of the earliest abolitionists. And if you look down here, you can see mention about Colonel Ray Sands and Captain Edward Sands, who were both officers in the Revolutionary War, as their kindred, Captain William Littlefield. Captain William Littlefield is linked to Nathaniel Littlefield, who owned my 8th great-grandfather. So when I said that Nathaniel Littlefield was linked to the Sands family, well, you can see it now in the history of Rhode Island, and specifically Block Island. And the slavery on Block Island was particularly brutal for the black slaves and even the indigenous slaves. And I showed this screenshot before, but I want you to see this one more time, because this is proof that Block Island was in fact a sundown town by every definition. If you were a black slave or an indigenous slave on Block Island, you could not be out after 9 p.m. And if you were caught, you would be whipped. And now I want you to imagine that you are Kate and you're seeing your husband and your children being treated this way. What level of rage would you have towards these people? But the famous witch of Block Island is not the only famous person from my lineage, because you also have the descendants of Newport Sands and Catherine. Like, for example, you have this famous painting that is now on display in a museum in Rhode Island. And this painting depicts someone who is one of my relatives. Her name is Violet Sands Hazard. She was born in 1798 on Block Island, and she lived to be 105 years old. And as you can see from the description of the painting here, you can see that she is in fact the granddaughter of Newport Sands and Catherine. And she is not the only famous person from my lineage. You also have the home of Cato Sands. And right here, you can see some quotes from the Cow Neck Peninsula Historical Society in Port Washington, New York. And now, this doesn't just affect Rhode Island, this affects a good bit of the northeastern part of the United States. And so, basically, the Sands family, they were a big family in the northeastern part of the U.S. And they owned many slaves, but this story is about a man named Cato Sands. Cato Sands was owned by a member of the Sands family whose name is Simon Sands. And he was freed in 1782. And he built a house in 1835. And here's an actual news story right here that actually affects my lineage. And it's actually descends from Rhode Island over to New York. Now, I want you to understand something. The Sands family, they owned a lot of slaves in the Northeast. And that house you're seeing right there was built by a slave. Yes, one of my family members built that home who was a slave. This is how deep the Northeast was when it came to slavery. It wasn't just Rhode Island, but also New York. But now you see how it's all connected, right? You're seeing how this all trickles down, because this started with Newport Sands and Catherine. And And do you remember that will by Sarah Sands where she would actually free a lot of my people? Well, I actually found a copy of that will, and what you're seeing is a piece of American history, because it's one of the few times in which you had a slave owner who willingly gave up not only just one slave, but essentially set a family rule that anyone with the Sands name could not essentially enslave people anymore. But however, Nathaniel Littlefield was related to the Sands family, but he was not a Sands. And if you read from this document here, you can actually see some of the names of my people who I am related to. In fact, when Sarah Sands gave up 2 black slaves who were women to a man named Samuel Niles, the instructions were that he was to keep them until age 30 and then let them free. So that means that this man could enslave these 2 innocent women all the way up until age 30. And that's what so many people are considering to be an abolitionist. And while that is technically true, there are some caveats, because she had the option to just straight up free us, but she freed us with some stipulations. So we've come to the end of the video, and I want to give us some shout outs. Shout out to the Block Island Historical Society, also the Rhode Island Historical Society, also the New England Historical Society, and also shout out to my ancestors: Mingo, Hercules, Benjamin, Newport Sands, Catherine. I want to tell this story because this story is important to tell. This video featured a lot of points in history, and I did a lot of research, and I know the history, and there's a lot more I could have added to this video, but I think I've proven the point. Slavery existed in the North, and the North had sundown towns too. And my family's lineage proves that. Some people have a problem with me making this series and making these videos. Well, then you have a problem with the truth. And at that point, that ain't my problem. Until next time, horns up, peace out, good night, and good luck.